The Alaska Triangle priest, too evil for history books, Father Silas Crowe, aged 47. In the winter of 1897, a tin box was discovered beneath the floorboards of the abandoned St. Lazarus Mission in Akutak, a vanished settlement 40 miles northeast of Nome. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating velvet, lay a human tongue preserved in alcohol, accompanied by a ledger written in Latin and what appeared to be coded ecclesiastical script. The tongue had been severed cleanly, suggesting surgical precision. The ledger contained 847 entries, each marking a confession received, followed by a series of symbols that corresponded to no known religious notation. At the bottom of the final page, in English, a single sentence had been scratched with such force that it tore through 3 subsequent pages. God has left this place, and Father Crowe remains. The box bore no official church seal, no documentation of origin, and no explanation for why a priest would collect and preserve human tissue as if cataloging specimens. When territorial officials forwarded the contents to the Diocese of Seattle, the package was lost in transit and never recovered. The only record of its existence comes from a single photograph taken by a surveyor named Thomas Gilchrist, who died 3 weeks later in circumstances the coroner's report described as unexplainable cardiac failure in a man of otherwise perfect health. The mission itself, according to every map produced after 1898, never existed. Wait, before we proceed to the archives, if this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The Alaska Territory in the final decade of the 19th century existed as a geography of erasure. Gold had drawn thousands to a land where winter could kill in minutes, and where entire communities appeared and vanished with the seasons, leaving behind only foundation stones and questions. The region that would later be termed the Alaska Triangle, that vast expanse stretching from Juneau to Anchorage to Barrow, had already begun accumulating its reputation for inexplicable disappearances and phenomena that defied documentation. Into this wilderness of forgetting, the Catholic Church sent missionaries with instructions to establish outposts of civilization and salvation among indigenous populations and the transient miners who populated the gold camps. Father Silas Crowe arrived in Alaska in the spring of 1891, according to fragmentary shipping records preserved in the Seattle Maritime Archive. He was 41 years old, a priest of the Jesuit order who had previously served in Montana and the Dakota Territory. The official correspondence that announced his assignment described him as a man of profound learning and spiritual fortitude, suited to the rigors of frontier ministry. He carried letters of recommendation from 3 bishops, each praising his dedication to the Church's mission among populations deemed difficult or resistant to conversion. What none of these letters mentioned, and what would only emerge in whispered accounts decades later, was that Father Crowe had been transferred 5 times in 7 years, always to more remote postings, always following incidents that church officials chose not to document in any official capacity. He established the St. Lazarus Mission in the autumn of 1891, selecting a location that puzzled the handful of trappers and prospectors who witnessed its construction. Akutak sat in a shallow valley where 3 rivers converged, a place the Inupiaq people had traditionally avoided during the darkest months. The name itself, according to linguistic analysis conducted in the 1960s, does not correspond to any known Inupiaq word, leading some researchers to conclude that the settlement's designation originated with Father Crowe himself, perhaps a corruption or deliberate obfuscation of the area's indigenous name. The mission consisted of a chapel, a residence, and a structure that early accounts referred to as a schoolhouse, though no evidence suggests formal education ever occurred within its walls. The first documented accounts of Father Crowe's presence in the region come from the journal of Henrik Thorson, a Norwegian trapper who maintained a seasonal camp approximately 15 miles from the mission. Thorson's entries, preserved in the Alaska State Historical Library, describe an initial meeting in November 1891. The priest speaks 6 languages and knows the names of plants I have never seen in these parts. He asks many questions about the winter, about how long the darkness lasts, about whether men's minds change when the sun disappears. He says he has come to study the nature of confession in a place where civilization has not yet imposed its structures of guilt. I did not understand his meaning. By the winter of 1892, the first indigenous families began arriving at St. Lazarus. They came not from nearby established communities, but from more distant regions, drawn by accounts, passed along trading routes and seasonal gathering sites, of a priest who offered not salvation, but something else entirely. The nature of this offering remains obscured by the deliberate vagueness of historical sources. A letter from a trader named Joseph Carmody to his brother in San Francisco, dated March 1893, mentions strange practices at the mission, ceremonies that do not match the Catholic rites I learned as a boy, and a quiet of silence among those who visit the priest that suggests not peace, but the silence of those who have lost something essential. The mission operated without official church oversight. The nearest Catholic authority resided in Sitka, more than 700 miles to the southeast, and Father Crowe submitted no reports, requested no supplies, and maintained no correspondence with his superiors. This absence of documentation created a void in the historical record that the Church apparently chose not to investigate. When researchers in later decades attempted to locate records of Father Crowe's ordination, his training, or his early career, they encountered a systematic absence of documentation. Files that should have existed had vanished. References in indices led to empty folders. The priest existed in official records as a name on a shipping manifest and nothing more. The winter of 1893 brought the first deaths. A group of prospectors attempting to reach the coast before the worst of the season stopped at St. Lazarus for shelter. Of the 6 men who entered the mission, only 2 emerged, and their accounts differed so drastically that territorial officials investigating the incident concluded both had suffered mental breaks induced by cold and isolation. One man, Samuel Pritchett, claimed that Father Crowe had conducted a ceremony of unburdening in which participants confessed not sins, but memories, speaking them aloud into a darkness so complete that it seemed to consume sound itself. The other survivor, Isaac Dearborn, insisted he remembered nothing of the days spent at the mission except a pervasive smell of copper and the sensation of having lost something he could not name, but whose absence haunted him with the weight of phantom pain. The 4 men who died were found scattered across a radius of 3 miles from the mission, each separated from the others, each frozen in positions that suggested they had been walking away from something with singular determination. The peculiar detail that troubled the investigating marshal was that all 4 had removed their boots and outer garments despite the temperature being 40 degrees below zero. They had walked barefoot through snow until they fell. The marshal's report, filed in May 1894, included a single line that would later become significant. The priest expressed no surprise at this outcome and suggested that some men, upon truly seeing themselves, choose to walk away from that vision, even if it means walking into death. Throughout 1894 and 1895, the St. Lazarus Mission continued to operate in its fashion, drawing visitors whose reasons for seeking out Father Crowe remained deliberately unspoken in the few contemporary accounts that survive. A Hudson's Bay Company factor named Robert McLeish mentioned the mission in a letter to his supervisor, noting that indigenous trappers bringing furs to the trading post spoke of the priest with a quality of unease that McLeish found impossible to categorize as either fear or reverence. "They say he collects voices," McLeish wrote. "When I asked what this meant, they would not elaborate, but several mentioned that those who confess to Father Crowe leave the mission speaking differently, as if some fundamental character of their speech has been altered." The year 1896 brought the first formal complaint to church authorities. A Jesuit missionary named Father Augustine Poirier, working out of a mission 200 miles to the south, traveled to St. Lazarus after hearing accounts from indigenous families who had visited both locations. Father Poirier's report to the Diocese of Seattle, discovered in Archdiocesan archives in 1973, described conditions at St. Lazarus that he found inconsistent with the practice of Catholic ministry and suggestive of a departure from both doctrine and sanity. He noted that the chapel contained no crucifix, no Stations of the Cross, no familiar iconography of the faith. Instead, the walls were covered with what appeared to be linguistic notations, phonetic symbols, grammatical structures, and what Poirier described as maps of speech rendered in forms both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Father Poirier's report continued with observations about Father Crowe himself, describing a man who had adopted mannerisms and patterns of speech that suggested not devotion to God, but devotion to some principle I cannot name. During their conversation, Father Crowe apparently explained his work as an exploration of the relationship between language and soul, between the act of confession and the structure of identity. "He told me," Poirier wrote, "that in the darkness of an Arctic winter, when men are isolated from society's reinforcement of their constructed selves, the true nature of conscience becomes visible, and through proper technique, it can be extracted, preserved, and studied." When I objected on theological grounds, he asked me if I had ever considered what happens to the sins we confess, where they go, what form they take, whether the act of speaking them aloud gives them a substance that persists after the words fade. The Diocese of Seattle forwarded Father Poirier's report to the Archbishop's office with a request for investigation and possible removal of Father Crowe from his posting. The response, dated November 1896, has never been found, and no evidence suggests any action was taken. Father Poirier himself disappeared in January 1897 while traveling between missions. His body was discovered in March, frozen in a riverbed, his journal missing from his possession. The official cause of death was listed as misadventure, though the factor at the nearest trading post noted that Father Poirier had been an experienced traveler who knew the dangers of winter passage and would not have attempted to cross the river at a point known to be treacherous. The settlement of Akutak reached its largest population in the winter of 1896–97, with perhaps 40 individuals residing in structures built around the mission. They came from diverse origins: Inupiaq families, Russian fur traders, American prospectors, and a handful of others whose backgrounds remained deliberately obscure. What united them was a shared quality that contemporary observers struggle to articulate. A letter from a mail carrier named Douglas Finch described the residents of Akutak as people who seemed to be living in the aftermath of something rather than in anticipation of anything, as if they had all passed through an experience that severed their connection to ordinary human concern. The winter darkness of 1896–97 lasted from November through January, that period when the sun does not rise above the horizon and the world exists in a twilight that transforms perception and psychology. It was during this darkness that events at St. Lazarus reached whatever conclusion they reached, though the specifics remain fragmentary and contradictory. What is documented is that by March 1897, when the first travelers reached Akutak with the returning light, the settlement had been abandoned. Every structure stood intact, personal belongings remained in place, food supplies sat untouched in storage, but no human presence could be found. The most detailed account of the abandoned settlement comes from a prospector named William Cutter, who arrived at Akutak on March 12, 1897, seeking shelter during a storm. His testimony, given to a territorial marshal 6 weeks later and preserved in the Alaska Territorial Court records, described a scene of systematic departure. It appeared that every resident had simply ceased whatever they were doing and left. A pot hung over a fire pit, the contents long since burned away. A child's doll sat on a windowsill. But the quality of the silence was unlike any abandonment I had previously witnessed. It felt not like people had left, but like they had been removed, extracted from the place as one might extract a stain from cloth. Cutter's account noted specific details about the mission itself. The chapel doors stood open, despite the cold. Inside, the linguistic notations on the walls had been partially effaced, as if someone had attempted to erase them but abandoned the effort midway. The residents showed signs of habitation up until very recently. Frost had not yet accumulated inside, suggesting heat had been present within the previous day or two. And in the structure designated as the schoolhouse, Cutter found what he described as a chamber arranged like a surgeon's theater, with a central chair surrounded by tables bearing instruments whose purpose I could not determine, though they appeared designed for extremely precise work. It was Cutter who discovered the tin box beneath the floorboards of Father Crowe's residence. He had been searching for supplies, he claimed, or perhaps for some explanation for the settlement's abandonment. The box was hidden under a loose board near the hearth, wrapped in canvas and sealed with wax. Inside, the preserved tongue, the ledger, and a second document that Cutter mentioned in his testimony, but which does not appear in any subsequent account. A letter addressed to those who come after, that Cutter claimed he read once before it dissolved in my hands, as if the paper itself could not bear the weight of what was written upon it. According to Cutter's testimony, the letter purported to be Father Crowe's final statement, though Cutter's memory of its contents proved unreliable under questioning. He recalled phrases rather than complete sentences. The mechanism of conscience requires a physical substrate. Language is not merely descriptive but ontologically constitutive. I have learned what the confessional truly collects. When pressed for clarity, Cutter became agitated and insisted that the letter had contained instructions for undoing what he had done, though he could not remember what those instructions entailed. The territorial marshal noted in his report that Cutter's mental state appeared compromised and that his testimony should be regarded with appropriate skepticism. The ledger itself, according to the single photograph that survives, contained entries in multiple languages: Latin, Russian, English, and several indigenous languages of the region. Each entry followed a similar format: a date, a set of initials, and a phrase in one language, followed by what appeared to be phonetic transcriptions in several others. Analysis of the visible entries suggests Father Crowe was documenting specific words or phrases spoken during confessions, tracking not the content of sins confessed, but the particular ways those sins were articulated. One entry, partially legible in the photograph, reads, March 7, 1896, HT, I have done harm. Note, lateral voicing in second syllable suggests internalization of guilt structure. Extraction successful. The photograph itself presents authentication challenges. Thomas Gilchrist, the surveyor who allegedly took the photograph, worked for a mining concern that kept meticulous records of his assignments. According to company documents, Gilchrist was nowhere near Akutak in March 1897. He was, in fact, conducting surveys near the Yukon River, more than 300 miles to the east. The photograph surfaced only after his death, found among his personal effects by his widow, who sold it to a collector of Alaska frontier memorabilia. Forensic analysis conducted in 1981 on the surviving print suggested it was taken with equipment consistent with the period and that it had not been obviously manipulated. But the question of how Gilchrist obtained it, if not through personal presence at the scene, has never been resolved. Gilchrist's death on April 3, 1897, added another layer of mystery to the account. He was found in his tent by colleagues, dead in his bedroll with no signs of violence or illness. The company physician who examined the body noted that Gilchrist appeared to have died during sleep, possibly of cardiac failure, though the man was only 32 years old and had no history of heart disease. More peculiar was a detail mentioned in the physician's private journal but not included in the official death report. Gilchrist's mouth was open at the time of death, and his tongue was discolored in a manner the physician described as resembling chemical exposure, though no chemicals were present at the scene, and no explanation for such discoloration presented itself. Territorial authorities, responding to Cutter's testimony and the growing number of rumors circulating through the region's trading posts and mining camps, dispatched a marshal named Clayton Rourke to investigate the abandoned settlement. Rourke reached Akutak in May 1897, accompanied by 2 deputies and a guide from the native population who agreed to lead them to the site but refused to enter the settlement itself. Rourke's official report, filed in June 1897, acknowledged the abandonment and noted the peculiar arrangement of the buildings and the absence of any indication of where the residents might have gone. He made no mention of the tin box, the preserved tongue, or any of the more disturbing details from Cutter's testimony. However, Rourke's personal journal, discovered by his granddaughter in 1958 and subsequently deposited in the Anchorage Museum archives, told a different story. In entries marked "Not for Official Record," Rourke described experiencing severe psychological distress during the 3 days he spent examining the settlement. He noted recurring auditory hallucinations, voices speaking in languages he did not recognize, though he somehow understood they were recounting memories of actions taken and harm caused. He described finding evidence that the chapel had been used for purposes far removed from Catholic liturgy, including restraints built into the pews and stains on the wooden floor that suggested biological material had been repeatedly spilled and imperfectly cleaned. Most disturbing to Rourke was the discovery of a chamber beneath the schoolhouse, accessed through a trap door concealed under straw matting. The chamber, approximately 10 feet square and 7 feet high, contained shelves lined with glass jars. Most of the jars had been smashed, their contents, which Rourke described as preserved biological specimens of a nature I could not determine, had decayed into unidentifiable residue. 3 jars remained intact. Rourke did not specify what they contained, writing only that the sight of them produced in me a conviction that I was looking at something removed from living persons, though by what method and for what purpose I could not fathom and preferred not to contemplate. Rourke's journal entries became increasingly erratic during his stay at Akutak. On his final night at the settlement, he wrote, "I heard voices from the chapel, though I was alone. When I investigated, I found only darkness and silence, but the quality of that silence felt inhabited, as if something remained present without manifesting visually. I experienced a powerful compulsion to speak, to confess some burden, though I could not identify what burden I carried. The compulsion grew so intense that I fled the chapel and spent the remainder of the night outside the settlement, watching the buildings from a distance, convinced that if I spoke within those walls, something essential would be taken from me, and I would become like those people who had lived here, hollowed out, reduced to the aftermath of themselves." The next morning, Rourke and his men departed Akutak. His official report recommended that the settlement be noted as abandoned and that no effort be made to track the missing residents, as the likelihood of their survival after this time is minimal, and the expenditure of resources to search the vast wilderness surrounding the site cannot be justified. He made no recommendation regarding the mission or its structures. Within a year, Akutak had disappeared from most maps of the region. The Geological Survey map of 1898 showed the 3 converging rivers, but no settlement. It was as if the cartographers had reached a collective, unspoken decision that the place was better forgotten. The fate of Father Silas Crowe himself presents the central void in this narrative. No death certificate exists, no burial record, no subsequent sighting in any location. The priest simply vanished from documentation as thoroughly as the settlement he had founded. However, fragmentary accounts from indigenous oral traditions, collected by anthropologists in the 1920s and 30s, suggest that a figure matching Father Crowe's description was seen in various locations across the Alaska Triangle for years after Okutok's abandonment. These accounts describe a man traveling alone through the winter darkness, moving from community to community, but never staying more than a single night. Always asking the same questions about language and memory, about what is lost when words are spoken aloud and never retrieved. One account, recorded by anthropologist Edward Curtis during his documentation of Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures, describes a Tlingit elder's memory of an encounter with the priest who listened too carefully. According to this account, the priest appeared at a village during the winter of 1899 and requested permission to speak with anyone willing to share stories. Those who accepted his invitation entered his tent alone and emerged hours later, invariably describing a sense of having been emptied by the experience, though they could not articulate what had been taken. The priest departed before dawn, leaving behind only a smell that the elder compared to metal and winter and the moment before speech becomes thought. Similar accounts appear sporadically across Alaska and the Yukon Territory throughout the first decade of the 20th century. Always in winter, always in isolated communities, always involving a solitary figure conducting interviews or ceremonies that participants described in terms of loss and extraction. By 1910, these accounts cease. Whatever phenomenon they described, if they described a real phenomenon at all and not merely a recurring myth or collective projection, had either concluded or moved beyond the region. The question that investigators, both historical and contemporary, continually return to is, what was Father Crowe attempting to achieve? The preserved tongue, the linguistic notations, the ledgers tracking confessional speech, these elements suggest a project, a methodical investigation with defined parameters and goals. Researchers who have studied the case have proposed various theories, ranging from the psychological to the theological to the purely speculative. Dr. Margaret Thorne, a linguist who examined the surviving photograph of the ledger in 1975, suggested that Father Crowe might have been pursuing what she termed acoustic archaeology, an attempt to document and preserve the exact phonetic characteristics of confessional speech across cultures and languages. Thorne noted that the period in which Father Crowe operated coincided with early developments in linguistic anthropology and the nascent field of phonetics. Perhaps, she theorized, the priest was conducting a kind of field research, using the isolation of the Alaska frontier and the unique psychological conditions of the Arctic winter to study how human beings articulate guilt and self-awareness across linguistic boundaries. However, Thorne's theory fails to account for the more disturbing physical evidence, the preserved biological specimens, the surgical precision of the severed tongue, the accounts of participants feeling emptied after encounters with the priest. These elements suggest something beyond academic research, something that crossed the boundary between investigation and intervention. Dr. Harold Kreisler, a psychiatrist who wrote extensively about frontier psychology in the 1960s, proposed that Father Crowe suffered from what would now be recognized as a severe delusional disorder, possibly triggered or exacerbated by the extreme isolation and darkness of the Arctic environment. Kreisler suggested that the priest developed an elaborate system of belief around the confessional ritual, coming to view it not as a spiritual practice, but as a literal extraction of some psychological or spiritual substance. The linguistic notations, the preservation of biological material, the systematic documentation, these were the expressions of a fracturing mind attempting to impose order on internal chaos through increasingly baroque ritual. Kreisler's interpretation draws support from the accounts of Father Crowe's psychological state in the months before the settlement's abandonment. The few contemporary descriptions suggest a man increasingly fixated on minutiae, obsessively refining his techniques, speaking in terms that combined theological language with proto-scientific terminology in ways that suggested profound confusion about the nature of his own work. Yet this theory, too, leaves questions unanswered. How did a single man suffering from severe mental illness convince dozens of people to participate in his rituals? Why did they stay? What did they experience that kept them returning to the mission? A third interpretation, advanced by religious historian Father Thomas Brennan in a controversial 1989 paper, suggested that Father Crowe might have been engaged in what Brennan termed experiential theology, an attempt to make tangible and observable the spiritual mechanics of confession and absolution. Brennan noted that the Catholic doctrine of confession involves a genuine transformation, a literal removal of sin from the soul through the sacramental act. Perhaps, Brennan theorized, Father Crowe took this doctrine seriously in a way that led him to seek physical evidence of spiritual transformation. If sins could be truly removed through confession, might they not leave some trace, some residue that could be observed and studied? Brennan's paper was widely criticized within the Catholic theological community for lending credibility to what most scholars regarded as the actions of a disturbed individual rather than a legitimate theological inquiry. The Vatican issued no official comment on the case, and attempts by researchers to access any church records related to Father Crowe have been consistently denied or deflected. The few church officials who have commented on the case have suggested that Father Crowe, if he existed as documented, represented a tragic example of a priest who lost his way in both spiritual and psychological terms, and that his actions, whatever they were, should not be understood as having any connection to legitimate Catholic practice or theology. Modern psychological researchers have approached the case from another angle entirely, focusing on the effects of extreme environmental conditions on consciousness and identity. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist specializing in isolation effects, published a study in 2003 examining historical accounts of psychological phenomena in Arctic communities. Chen noted that the combination of extreme darkness, social isolation, and severe cold creates conditions in which normal cognitive boundaries become permeable. People in such conditions often report altered states of consciousness, heightened suggestibility, and experiences of depersonalization, a sense of being detached from one's own thoughts and identity. Chen suggested that whatever Father Crowe was doing at St. Lazarus, he was likely exploiting these environmental effects to induce profound psychological states in his participants. The confessional ritual, conducted in darkness and isolation, combined with whatever techniques of speech and attention Father Crowe had developed, might have produced genuine experiences of dissociation and identity dissolution. Participants might have genuinely felt that something was being removed from them, not because anything literal was being extracted, but because the ritual created conditions under which their normal sense of unified selfhood temporarily fragmented. This interpretation gains some support from studies of similar phenomena in other isolated religious communities. Throughout history, extreme ascetic practices, sensory deprivation, and ritualized confession have been used to produce altered states of consciousness that practitioners interpret according to their theological frameworks. What made Father Crowe's approach distinctive, according to Chen, was his apparent attempt to preserve and study these states systematically, to move from spiritual practice to something resembling experimental protocol. Yet even this neurological interpretation cannot fully account for the physical evidence: the preserved tongue, the systematic notation, the glass jars containing biological specimens. These elements suggest that Father Crowe's work involved not merely psychological manipulation, but actual physical intervention. The question of what, exactly, he believed he was preserving, and why he believed preservation was possible or necessary, remains unanswered. The disappearance of the settlement's residents adds another dimension to the mystery. 40 people do not simply vanish without leaving traces. Yet despite the efforts of territorial authorities and later historical researchers, no graves have been found near Ayutthaya. No reports of groups of travelers matching the description of the missing residents appear in records from surrounding communities. No evidence of their fate has emerged. The most logical explanation, that they died during the winter, perhaps of disease or starvation, and their bodies were consumed by scavengers or buried under snow, is contradicted by the evidence of recent habitation that William Cutter observed, suggesting the settlement was abandoned very shortly before his arrival. Alternative theories propose that the residents dispersed, individually or in small groups, choosing to disappear into the vast wilderness of Alaska rather than return to populated areas. But why? What would motivate such a collective decision? And why would they leave behind all their supplies and possessions if they intended to survive in the wilderness? The most unsettling possibility, rarely voiced in academic discussions but persistent in local folklore, is that the residents of Akutukok underwent something during that final winter that made their continued existence in normal society impossible. The accounts of participants feeling emptied or hollowed out, the descriptions of people who seem to be living in aftermath rather than anticipation, these suggest a transformation of such profundity that those who experienced it could not or would not return to ordinary human community. Perhaps they walked into the wilderness not to die, but because they no longer fit within the structures of conventional human life. In 1923, a prospector named Robert Finley reported encountering a group of people living in a makeshift encampment deep in the Brooks Range, far north of any established settlement. Finley's account, given to a trading post operator and recorded in the operator's journal, described individuals who seemed to have forgotten language, communicating through gestures and sounds that resembled speech without constituting any recognizable language. When Finley attempted to approach them, they fled, vanishing into the terrain with such speed and coordination that he wondered if he had hallucinated the encounter. He noted one detail that he found particularly disturbing. All of them moved in complete silence, their feet making no sound on the ground, as if they had learned to exist without impact on the physical world. The encampment, when Finley attempted to relocate it with a guide the following day, could not be found. No trace remained of habitation. Finley concluded that he must have been mistaken about the location, though he remained convinced of what he had seen. Researchers who later examined Finley's account noted that his description of the location placed the encampment approximately 200 miles north of Akutukok, a possible distance for determined travelers to cover across multiple seasons. Whether the group Finley encountered had any connection to the St. Lazarus mission remains purely speculative. The photograph taken by Thomas Gilchrist remains the only visual documentation of the evidence from Akutukok. When researchers attempted to locate the original tin box, ledger, and preserved tongue in the decades following the incident, they discovered that the package sent to the Diocese of Seattle had indeed been lost in transit, as initially reported. No duplicate photographs were known to exist. The single print that survived in Gilchrist's effects was donated to the Alaska State Museum in 1965 by his granddaughter. Museum staff noted at the time of donation that the photograph had deteriorated significantly, with portions of the image becoming illegible or distorted. By 1990, when researchers requested high-resolution scans for analysis, they discovered that the photograph had deteriorated further, to the point where critical details were no longer visible. A curator who examined the photograph in its original frame discovered something peculiar. The deterioration followed a pattern that suggested not age or environmental damage, but deliberate chemical degradation, as if someone had applied a solution to specific areas of the image to obscure certain details while leaving others intact. The curator noted in her report that the pattern of degradation focuses specifically on the visible text in the ledger, rendering the entries illegible, while leaving the image of the tin box and its context relatively clear. This suggests intentional rather than random deterioration, though to what purpose remains mysterious. The question of who would want to obscure the ledger's contents and when this obscuring might have occurred has never been satisfactorily answered. The photograph passed through several hands between Gilchrist's death and its donation to the museum, including a period in the 1940s when it was part of a private collection owned by an ecclesiastical art dealer in Boston. Church historians have suggested that if the dealer was acting on behalf of religious authorities concerned about the contents of the ledger becoming public knowledge, he might have taken steps to render the document illegible while preserving the image as a whole to avoid raising suspicions about complete destruction. This possibility gains some credence from the broader pattern of documentary erasure surrounding Father Crowe. The systematic absence of official church records, the disappearance of the original evidence, the death or silence of key witnesses. Taken individually, these could be attributed to the normal chaos and loss that characterizes frontier history. Taken collectively, they suggest deliberate suppression, a coordinated effort to remove Father Silas Crowe from the historical record as completely as possible. Who would undertake such an effort? The Catholic Church had both motive and capability. An ordained priest conducting bizarre experiments on isolated populations, preserving human tissue, operating outside all normal ecclesiastical supervision, such a figure would represent a profound embarrassment and potential scandal. The Church's historical response to problematic clergy has often involved quiet removal from ministry and relocation to remote postings where they could do minimal damage to the institution's reputation. But Father Crowe was already at the remotest possible posting. The only option beyond removal was erasure. Yet, if the Church did engage in a systematic suppression of evidence, why allow any documentation to survive at all? Why not destroy Gilchrist's photograph, suppress Rourke's journal, ensure that Cutter's testimony never entered the territorial record? The incomplete nature of the erasure suggests either limited capability, the Church could not locate or control all sources of information, or limited intent, a desire to obscure rather than eliminate, to make the truth difficult to find without making it completely inaccessible. This pattern of partial erasure is consistent with how institutions often handle their most troubling figures. Complete elimination of all records raises questions and attracts attention. But fragmentary documentation, scattered across disparate archives, contradictory and incomplete, allows the truth to exist in a form that renders it effectively inaccessible to all but the most dedicated researchers. The story becomes folklore rather than history, a collection of disconnected anecdotes rather than a coherent narrative. In the indigenous oral traditions of the region, Father Crowe persists not as a historical figure, but as a warning and a cautionary archetype. He becomes the man who listened too carefully, the priest who wanted to see what should not be seen, the one who tried to make tangible what must remain mysterious. Stories told to children emphasize the danger of speaking too freely, of confessing to strangers, of allowing anyone to know the entirety of your thoughts. In some versions, Father Crowe becomes a creature rather than a man, something that wears human form but hungers for something essential that humans carry within them, something that can be released through speech and captured if one knows the proper method. These folkloric transformations of Father Crowe reflect a psychological truth even if they do not reflect historical fact. The priest represents a violation of the unspoken contract between confessor and confessed, between the one who speaks vulnerability and the one who receives it. Confession in virtually all human cultures involves a profound act of trust, the revelation of hidden transgression, secret shame, private guilt. The confessor is bound by that trust, obligated to hold what is revealed in sacred confidence, to use the knowledge only for the spiritual benefit of the one confessing. Father Crowe, if the accounts are to be believed, betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way, treating confession not as a spiritual practice, but as a harvest, a gathering of raw material for purposes known only to himself. The question that haunts every examination of this case is, what did Father Crowe discover? If his project had a goal beyond mere documentation, if he genuinely believed he was learning something about the nature of confession, language, identity, or the human soul, what conclusions did he reach? Did the ledger, before its contents became illegible, contain findings? Did Father Crowe leave any statement of his results, any articulation of what he believed he had proven or discovered? The letter that William Cutter claimed to have found and read, the letter that allegedly dissolved in his hands, represents the only possible answer. But Cutter's account of that letter's contents was so fragmentary and contradictory that it provides no clear insight. The phrases he remembered, "The mechanism of conscience requires a physical substrate. I have learned what the confessional truly collects," suggest that Father Crowe believed he had discovered something tangible, something that could be observed and potentially isolated. But without the full text, without any corroborating documentation, these phrases remain tantalizing fragments that raise more questions than they answer. Some researchers have suggested that the answer lies not in what Father Crowe discovered, but in what he experienced. Perhaps the project was not successful, not a matter of proving a hypothesis, but of descending into an obsession that ultimately consumed him. The progression from methodical documentation to preservation of biological specimens to whatever occurred during that final winter suggests an escalation, a boundary progressively crossed until Father Crowe found himself so far from conventional practice that he could not return even if he wished to. The disappearance of the settlement's residents and Father Crowe himself might represent not the culmination of his project, but its collapse, the moment when the structure of meaning he had built around his work finally shattered, leaving only devastation and flight. This interpretation treats Father Crowe as a tragic figure, a man whose intellectual curiosity and spiritual fervor led him into territory he could not navigate, whose methods grew increasingly extreme as he pursued a goal that receded perpetually before him. It's a psychologically plausible narrative, consistent with historical patterns of obsession and delusion. Yet it fails to account for the specificity of the evidence, the systematic notation, the precise documentation, the surgical precision of the preserved tongue. These are not the marks of chaos or delusion, but of methodology, however aberrant that methodology might have been. The modern era of investigation into the Father Crowe case began in earnest in the 1970s, when a new generation of researchers interested in frontier psychology, alternative religious practices, and the history of the Alaska Triangle began revisiting archived materials with fresh perspectives. Dr. Helena Marsh, an anthropologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, led an expedition in 1976 to attempt to locate the site of Akutak using historical descriptions and geographical analysis. The expedition succeeded in identifying a location that matched the documented characteristics: 3 converging rivers, a shallow valley, appropriate distance from Nome. However, no structural remains could be found. The permafrost and seasonal flooding of the area would have destroyed or buried any wooden structures long ago, leaving only the possibility of foundation stones or other durable remnants. Dr. Marsh's team conducted extensive metal detection surveys and shallow excavations at the site. They found evidence of human habitation, metal artifacts consistent with the period, fire pits, a concentration of glass fragments that might have been jars or bottles. Most intriguingly, they discovered a stone foundation that appeared to include a below-ground chamber matching Rauch's description of the room beneath the schoolhouse. The chamber had partially collapsed, filled with decades of sediment and frozen earth. Excavation revealed shelving structures and additional glass fragments, but no preserved specimens, no documentation, no definitive proof that this was indeed the St. Lazarus mission. What the excavation did reveal was peculiar. Chemical analysis of the soil from the chamber showed unusually high concentrations of alcohol compounds and what appeared to be trace organic material of human origin. Modern forensic testing suggested the presence of preserved tissue that had degraded over time. The distribution pattern of these traces suggested that multiple specimens had been stored in the chamber and had broken or degraded, releasing their contents into the surrounding soil. While this finding was consistent with the historical accounts, it could not definitively prove them. Human remains or preserved tissue might have ended up in that location through various means unrelated to Father Crowe's alleged activities. Dr. Marsh's work faced significant criticism from both academic peers and local indigenous leaders. Academic critics questioned her methodology, her interpretation of fragmentary evidence, and her willingness to treat unverified historical accounts as reliable source material. Indigenous leaders objected to the excavation itself, arguing that the site, if it was indeed the location of Father Crowe's mission, should be left undisturbed out of respect for those who had suffered there. The controversy ultimately led to the cessation of further archaeological work at the site and a broader reconsideration of how researchers should approach sensitive historical locations in Alaska. In the years following Dr. Marsh's expedition, the site has been visited informally by various researchers, journalists, and others interested in the case. Several have reported unusual psychological experiences at the location, feelings of unease, auditory hallucinations, or vivid dreams following their visits. Skeptics attribute these experiences to suggestion and expectation. The site's reputation creates psychological priming that produces experiences consistent with that reputation. Yet, the consistency of the reports, even among visitors unaware of each other's experiences, has led some researchers to wonder if environmental factors at the location, unusual acoustic properties, electromagnetic anomalies, or other natural phenomena, might contribute to altered states of consciousness. A 2015 study by environmental psychologist Dr. Marcus Webb examined several locations in the Alaska Triangle associated with mysterious events and disappearances. Webb's team conducted extensive measurements of electromagnetic fields, infrasound, and other environmental factors that have been linked to psychological effects. At the suspected site of Akutak, they recorded anomalous infrasound patterns, very low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of conscious hearing, but capable of producing feelings of anxiety, dread, and perceived presence of unseen entities. Webb suggested that these infrasound patterns, possibly produced by wind interactions with the valley's geography, might have contributed to the psychological atmosphere at Father Crowe's mission, potentially enhancing the effects of whatever practices he conducted there. Webb's findings have been used both to support and to challenge the extraordinary aspects of the Father Crowe narrative. Supporters argue that the environmental factors demonstrate why the location was particularly suitable for Father Crowe's work. The natural conditions created a psychological state that enhanced suggestibility and made participants more susceptible to whatever techniques the priest employed. Critics argue that the same environmental factors explain the entire phenomenon. Father Crowe might have been conducting relatively conventional religious services, but the location's natural effects produced the unusual psychological experiences that participants later reported. Neither interpretation can be definitively proven with the available evidence. The case of Father Silas Crowe remains, fundamentally, a collection of fragments. Testimonies, photographs, documents, each incomplete, each raising as many questions as it answers. The central narrative is clear enough. A priest established a mission in the Alaskan wilderness, conducted some form of investigation or practice involving confession and language, and both the priest and his congregation vanished in circumstances that have never been explained. Everything beyond this skeleton of fact is speculation, interpretation, and projection. What can be said with confidence is that Father Crowe's story has become part of the mythos of the Alaska Triangle, one of many narratives of disappearance and mystery that characterize the region. Whether the story represents historical truth, folklore elaboration on a more mundane reality, or some combination of both, it serves a psychological and cultural function. It articulates anxieties about isolation, about what happens to people and communities cut off from the moderating influence of society, about the potential for spiritual practice to become something darker when removed from institutional oversight and traditional constraints. The preserved tongue, that central artifact of the mystery, stands as a symbol for all that remains unspoken in this narrative. A tongue is the instrument of confession, of speech, of the articulation of inner experience into external language. Severed and preserved, it becomes mute testimony to something that cannot be fully expressed. The experience of those who encountered Father Crowe, the nature of what he was attempting to achieve, the fate of those who disappeared. Like the photograph that deteriorated to obscure crucial evidence, like the letter that allegedly dissolved in William Cutter's hands, the preserved tongue represents knowledge that exists in a form that prevents its full communication. The Alaska Triangle, that vast region where normal rules seem suspended and where disappearances accumulate with troubling frequency, provides the appropriate context for Father Silas Crowe's story. The wilderness of Alaska has always served as a space of transformation, a place where people go to escape, to reinvent themselves, to pursue visions that could not be pursued in more settled lands. Some of those transformations lead to new beginnings, others lead to dissolution and loss. Father Crowe's transformation, if it can be called that, led to a mystery that continues to resonate more than a century after the events occurred. In recent years, the story has attracted new attention through various media, documentaries, podcasts, online investigations. Each new treatment adds its own interpretations, theories, and speculations. Some portray Father Crowe as a villain, a predator who used his position of spiritual authority to exploit vulnerable people. Others present him as a tragic figure, a man whose intellectual ambitions exceeded his moral boundaries, who pursued knowledge at costs he did not anticipate and could not control. Still others suggest he was simply insane, that the isolation and darkness of the Arctic broke his mind, and that the elaborate structure attributed to his actions is mostly retrospective projection onto what was actually chaotic delusion. None of these interpretations fully satisfies the evidence. Father Crowe remains unknowable, as remote and mysterious as the land that swallowed him. The historical record preserves only his shadow. Fragmentary accounts, deteriorated photographs, testimonies from people who themselves vanished or died. Building a complete understanding from such materials is impossible. The best that can be achieved is a reconstruction that acknowledges its own limitations, that presents the fragments without claiming to have assembled them into perfect clarity. What endures is the image itself, a tin box discovered beneath floorboards, containing a severed tongue preserved in alcohol and a ledger documenting 847 confessions through linguistic notation. This image, whether it represents literal truth or metaphorical condensation of a more diffuse reality, captures something essential about the Alaska Triangle and the mysteries it contains. It suggests that beneath the surface of documented history, beneath the familiar landscape of known facts and verified events, lies another stratum, a realm of experiences that defy easy categorization, events that resist narrative closure, phenomena that remain stubbornly mysterious despite all attempts at explanation. Father Silas Crowe belongs to that deeper stratum. His story touches the surface of documented history at only a few points. A shipping manifest, a surveyor's photograph, a marshal's report, before sinking back into the territory of the unknowable. To follow his path is to trace a descent from the known world into darkness, from the familiar structures of religious ministry into a practice that has no name and leaves no clear testimony of its nature or purpose. Those who encountered him emerged changed, hollowed out, speaking of loss and extraction. And then they vanished, walking into winter wilderness and leaving behind only questions. The greatest mystery is not what Father Crowe did, but what he knew. Did he discover something genuine about the nature of conscience, language, or human identity? Or did he descend into delusion so profound that it consumed not only himself, but those around him? The evidence permits no definitive answer. We are left with fragments, shadows, the echo of voices speaking across more than a century, their words degraded by time until only the impression of meaning remains. The sense that something significant occurred, something that cannot be fully articulated, but whose effects persist like the discoloration on Thomas Gilchrist's tongue, like the infrasound waves that still pulse through the valley where Akutak once stood. In the end, Father Crowe's legacy is the question itself. His story asks what it means to confess. What is released when we speak our hidden truths aloud? What becomes of those articulated secrets in the space between speaker and listener? It asks where the boundaries lie between spiritual practice and psychological manipulation, between investigation and violation, between the pursuit of knowledge and the infliction of harm. These are not questions with simple answers. They require holding multiple possibilities in tension, accepting ambiguity, acknowledging the limits of what can be known. The Alaska Triangle contains many such stories, accounts of people and places that touched the edge of explanation before slipping beyond it. Father Silas Crowe's mission stands among them, a monument to the persistent mystery that inhabits the far northern landscape. The wind still moves through the valley where Akutak once stood. The rivers still converge, and somewhere in the archives, in the memories passed down through generations, in the collective unconscious of those who know the North, Father Crowe remains, listening carefully, taking notes in coded script, attempting to preserve what should perhaps remain ephemeral, to capture what by its nature must remain free. The darkness of the Arctic winter, that long night when the sun does not rise and the world exists in perpetual twilight, creates conditions under which perception shifts and identity becomes negotiable. In that darkness, Father Crowe conducted his experiments, whatever they were. And in that darkness, 40 people experienced something that made their continued existence in ordinary human society impossible. What exactly transpired will never be known with certainty, but the effects ripple forward through time, touching those who investigate the story, asking them to consider what might lie beneath the surface of confession, language, and self. At the Alaska State Museum, in a climate-controlled storage facility, the deteriorated photograph awaits future researchers. The tin box is lost. The ledger's contents are illegible. Father Crowe himself is long gone, dissolved into the landscape like snow in spring melt. But the question remains, what was in that box? What did the ledger document? What did the priest believe he had discovered? Perhaps these questions have no answers. Perhaps the mystery itself is the point. A reminder that history, especially the history of the frontier, of isolated places where civilization's grip loosens and other possibilities emerge, contains depths that resist final explanation. The Alaska Triangle holds its secrets close. Father Silas Crowe is one of them. Too evil for the history books, not because of clear atrocities that can be documented and condemned, but because what he did exists in the space between categories, in the realm where spiritual practice, psychological manipulation, and genuine mystery intersect in ways that our frameworks of understanding cannot fully process. And so the story persists, passed along through academic papers and folklore, through museum archives and indigenous oral traditions, through documentary films and late-night conversations among those who know the North. It persists because it touches something essential about the human relationship with mystery, with the unknown, with the spaces where what we believe about ourselves and our world encounters evidence that those beliefs might be incomplete. Father Crowe's mission to the Alaska wilderness was, in some sense, a mission to the edges of human understanding. That he vanished into those edges, taking his congregation with him, seems somehow appropriate. Mysteries should remain in the realm of mystery. Some questions should stay unanswered. The tin box, the preserved tongue, the ledger documenting 847 confessions, these artifacts, whether they existed exactly as described or serve as condensed symbols through a more complex reality, mark the boundary between what can be known and what must be imagined. They invite investigation while simultaneously frustrating it, offering tantalizing details while withholding essential context. They are, in other words, perfect artifacts of the Alaska Triangle, objects that belong simultaneously to history and to legend, to fact and to nightmare. Father Silas Crowe, aged 47 when last documented, remains forever in that moment of incompletion. His project unfinished or unspeakable, his discoveries undocumented or suppressed, his fate unknown. He exists in the historical record as a question mark, a blank space where a person should be, a name attached to accounts so disturbing and uncertain that they resist integration into conventional historical narrative. And perhaps that is the most appropriate memorial for a man who dedicated himself to exploring the spaces between speech and silence, between what is said and what remains hidden, between the self that is presented and the self that is concealed in darkness. In the valley where three rivers converge, where Akutak once stood and now exists only as traces in frozen earth, the wind continues its eternal conversation with the landscape. If you were to visit that place, in winter, in the darkness, you might hear sounds that resemble voices speaking in unknown languages. You might feel a compulsion to speak, to confess, to articulate something you did not know you carried. You might sense a presence, attentive and hungry, listening carefully to every word. But these experiences, like the story of Father Crowe itself, exist in the uncertain territory between objective reality and psychological projection. They are shaped by expectation, by suggestion, by the human tendency to find meaning in ambiguous stimuli. They prove nothing and confirm nothing. They simply add another layer to the accumulated mystery, another fragment to the collection of fragments that constitute all we know and all we will ever know about the priest who came to the Alaska Triangle seeking something he could not name, and who vanished into the same darkness he had sought to illuminate. The severed tongue in its jar of alcohol stands as the final image, the symbol that cannot be decoded but only contemplated. Silent, preserved, separated from the body and voice that once gave it purpose, it represents all that remains unspoken in this narrative. The testimony that was never given, the confessions that were extracted and lost, the truth that dissolves when touched. It is the artifact of a mystery that will persist as long as people tell stories about the far north, about the darkness that descends when the sun departs, about what happens to those who venture too far into the spaces where human understanding fails and something other begins.